Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 46, and it's time for a Christmas ghost story. And you couldn't have more spooks to choose from because it's Selecting a Ghost, The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange from December 1883. And here's Paul to introduce the story.
Having made his fortune in the grocery business, Argentine D'Odd has developed a raft of social pretensions and acquired property and ancestry to match. He now lives in a moated medieval castle, with his own coat of arms and a carefully chosen gallery of instant ancestor portraits. All his new and venerable home lacks is a resident ghost, and now his wife's resourceful cousin, Jack Brocket, has met a man in a pub who can remedy that defect.
Selecting a Ghost was published in London Society, which is a magazine that's very closely connected with Conan Doyle's early days as a struggling doctor in Southsea, a suburb of Portsmouth. He settled in the town in 1882 after a disagreement with his former business partner, George Turnavine Budd. And Budd had promised Conan Doyle money to set him up in practice, but that never materialised. And it was at that time that Conan Doyle turned to James Hogg, the editor of London Society, who published some of Conan Doyle's earliest works and would go on to publish Selecting a Ghost. Hogg listened to Conan Doyle's predicament and paid him £10 advance on a short story, which allowed Conan Doyle to lay down his first quarter's rent on bush villas in Southsea. And that incident might give you a bit of a sense of how important London Society was. It was really something of a lifeline for the young Conan Doyle. Between 1880 and 1885, Hogg published 11 of Conan Doyle's stories, beginning with The American's Tale and ending with The Parson of Jackman's Gulch. The two men met periodically in London, and it was on one of those occasions in March 1882 that Hogg said he looked upon Conan Doyle as one of the coming men in literature. London Society was therefore a pretty safe bet for Conan Doyle if he couldn't get his work placed with other more prestigious magazines like Blackwood's or Cornhill. We know little about the writing of Selecting a Ghost. It's only really referred to in the context of another story that was submitted to James Hogg and London Society. And that was a piece about a three-eyed man that Conan Doyle conceived while he was ship surgeon on the Mayamba on a trip to West Africa in 1881. Now, we don't know what happened to that story, or indeed if it was ever completed, but Hogg appears to have paid Conan Doyle an advance for it, because there was then some disagreement over the fee in summer 1883. And in reporting this disagreement to his mother, Conan Doyle said, "Hogg has the ghosts now, but it is not published yet," which is our only reference in his published letters to this story. Hogg did indeed publish it later that year, in December 1883, and it was published that same month in the New York Times in the United States. But the story doesn't quite end there, because Hogg and Conan Doyle eventually fell out. In fact, they hadn't always seen eye to eye. When Conan Doyle offered his short story An Actor's Duel to London Society, he was frustrated that Hogg had failed to see the joke and wrote to his mother that Hogg's chief editorial fault is an utter want of sense of humour. It was something entirely beyond his comprehension. But the specific disagreement over Selecting a Ghost was actually about copyright. The story had been collected in a 3-volume work called Dreamland and Ghostland in 1887, but it was later collected in Mysteries and Adventures, an unendorsed collection of Conan Doyle's early fiction in London Society, which Hogg published in 1889. And it appears that Hogg was really trying to capitalise on Conan Doyle's newfound fame on the back of his success with Micah Clarke. Unfortunately, it came out the same time as Conan Doyle's own official collection of early tales, The Captain of the Pole Star, which was published by Longmans in 1890. Conan Doyle was incensed about Hogg's volume and made it clear in an interview with the Birmingham Weekly Mercury, in which he said, "Mysteries and Adventures is a pirated edition of tales written years ago in London society. Some of them when I was little more than a boy. It is rough on me having these youthful effusions brought out in this catchpenny fashion, but I have no legal redress. The less reviewed or read they are, the better." And Conan Doyle didn't anthologize the story himself. It's notable that it doesn't appear in the author's edition, the Conan Doyle stories, or the Crowber edition, which may have something to him regretting those youthful effusions, as he says. And it's one of those stories he perhaps felt was best left forgotten. And of course, we're going to do our best today to revive it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth pointing out as well, on the back of the last podcast, that he was reusing the name Goresthorpe Grange, which he'd used in the unpublished story, which we discussed last time. But what makes this story more confusing as well is it was published variously under different titles.
Yes.
So you have Selecting a Ghost, The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange, and then it appeared in other sources as The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange, The Secret of Goresthorpe Grange, or The Secret of the Grange. So tracing it can become quite difficult at times for anthologists and completists. It's also interesting to note that Doyle had this early success with London society, which was a very middle-brow
Yes.
bourgeois magazine. It didn't have the literary pretensions of say the Cornhill, but it did have a wide distribution, and it was a kind of almost, you could say in some ways, a Victorian version of Hello and sort of these popular magazines with easy articles.
Yeah.
And easy stories that are again designed to read on the train and so on, and also to bolster people up in the new middle class lifestyle, which was developing. It's quite funny, really, that some of Doyle's stories, because a number of these stories, he had 11 stories published in the magazine in all. And suddenly, it's quite dark and gothic stuff. But it does seem to have been something of a lifeline to him, that's for sure. But it's also fun, particularly in relation to this story, Selecting a Ghost, in that this was a magazine aimed really at a specific demographic.
Yes.
To bolster them, solidify their aspirations almost.
Yes.
And this story, as we'll find out, was actually poking fun
Yes.
at the aspirational lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. Selecting a Ghost also appears in the December 1883 issue of London Society, but the magazine was particularly noted for its sort of lavish Christmas specials as well, wasn't it? So, and Conan Doyle had written for quite a few of those in the past. In 1880 and 1881, he had stories in that as well. But there's quite a long history of these very celebrated Christmas specials. In fact, the 1872 edition features a very good ghost story by Lefanu called Dick on the Devil, which is about a ghost who is haunting an estate in Pendle in Lancashire, famous for the witches.
And near to Stonyhurst.
And very near to Stonyhurst, yeah, indeed, that's right. The other thing about London society is how Conan Doyle might have been introduced to it, because I think Gibson and Green in the bibliography of Conan Doyle's work mentioned that Charles Doyle had been an illustrator for James Hogg. And so Conan Doyle's father had illustrated a number of works, including Coleb's The Younger in Search of a Wife, Brave Men's Footsteps, and there is one called Friendly Hands and Kindly Words, stories illustrative of the laws of kindness, the power of perseverance, and the advantages of little helps. And I'll put one of the images from that into the show notes, because there's actually one there which is about a woman trying to stop a gentleman from going into the pub because he's clearly had too much, and it's a bit of a Yeah, a bit of a touchy one, that one.
Mm.
But it's interesting. So it might well be that actually Conan Doyle got his introduction to London society um, through his father.
And London Society did, like the Strand later, pride itself on the illustrations
Mm.
within its pages.
Mm.
Um, it's also perhaps worth mentioning when you talk about Christmas specials that, of course, Sherlock Holmes made his entry into the world in Beaton's
Of course.
Christmas Annual for 1887.
Yeah, of course, of course. You were mentioning there as well that selecting a ghost is really sort of pointing at the pretensions of
Mm.
the rising middle class, and you don't get anything better than that in the main character here, who's the wonderfully named Argentine D'Odd, D'Odd, isn't it?
Mm.
Whose real name is Silas, I think we discover
Mm.
at one point. Who's this grocer who's made his fortune and become one of the nouveau riches, as it were. Um, and there's he has a rather inflated view of himself. Um, yeah, in introducing him, it said, "I'm sure that nature never intended me to be a self-made man. There are times when I can hardly bring myself to realize that 20 years of my life were spent behind the counter of a grocer's shop in the East End of London, and that it was through such an avenue that I reached a wealthy independence and the possession of Goresthorpe Grange. My habits are conservative, and my tastes refined and aristocratic. I have a soul which spurns the vulgar herd." Quite a ridiculous character. But as well as purchasing Goresthorpe Grange, he's decided to resurrect the old family coat of arms to cement his newfound family position. And so he really plays on this idea that the Dodds had once been a great family and that he's sort of bringing them back into their rightful place. But his words would sort of, suggest otherwise. He says at one point, "Our family, the Dodds, date back to a prehistoric era, as is to be inferred from the fact that their advent into British history is not commented on by any trustworthy historian," which is a great line as well. And Conan Doyle had himself done quite a bit to resurrect his own family crest. He had a long-standing interest in heraldry and his own genealogy through the influence of his mother. And in fact, he talks about this in Memories and Adventures. He says, I trust the reader will indulge me in my excursion into these family matters, which are of vital interest to the family, but must be tedious to the outsider. As I am on the subject, I wish to say a word about my mother's family, the more so as she was great on archaeology and had, with the help of Sir Arthur Vickers, Ulster King of Arms, and himself a relative, worked out her descent for more than 500 years, and so composed a family tree which lies before me as I write, and on which many of the great ones of the earth have roosted. So that's Conan Doyle's mother, Mary Foley, and actually the coat of arms that Conan Doyle resurrected included both the Doyle and the Foley crests.
And it's obviously something made a huge impact on him from his early childhood, with sitting listen to his mother's stories of the family history, and together they'd build these castles in the air.
Mm,
And this idea obviously stayed with Doyle for life, and it obviously influences his medieval romances, The White Company
mm,
and Sir Nigel. And it also turns up in some very, very odd places, notably in his semi-autobiographical novel, The Stark Munro Letters,
mm,
which appeared between 1894 and 1895 in periodical form and then in book publication.
mm.
But in that, we get a view of Stark Munro, who is essentially Conan Doyle,
Yes,
a
yes.
young doctor, and his struggles to find professional success. But Munro's mother is described thus when she's telling her son these stories. Then there is her family pride. That is a very vital portion of the mother. On the Pakenham side, she is a Pakenham, the family can boast of some fairly good men. I mean on the direct line. But when we get on the side branches, there is not a monarch upon earth who does not roost on that huge family tree. Not once, nor twice, but thrice did the Plantagenets intermarry with us. The Dukes of Brittany courted our alliance, and the Percys of Northumberland intertwined themselves with our whole illustrious record. And this is particularly interesting because it really does point to this being essentially Mary Foley.
Yeah,
She was related to the Packs
yes.
rather than the Pakenhams. This is obviously just Doyle doing a little bit of not too subtle disguise. But his mother did boast about family connections, distant family connections to the Plantagenets, and
Mm,
certainly the Percys of Northumberland.
mm.
So this is Doyle's own family history getting mixed up here, and it's a very pointed view of his mother.
Yes.
And in a way, it's a better picture than you get in Memories and Adventures.
Yeah, it is actually, isn't it? And
Mm,
and I do think the character of Argentine D'Odd here is, while he's poking fun at middle classes as well, there are a lot of his values that are sort of coming in under the radar here.
mm,
And
mm,
this one about well, first of all, he actually says in Memories and Adventures that that the family name Doyle actually comes from D oil, D apostrophe
mm,
oil,
mm,
like D apostrophe odd.
mm,
Um, he also talks about his lineage to the Staffordshire Doyles,
mm,
um, which is essentially an English clan rather than the later Irish branches. So he says, we can only claim to be the main stem by virtue of community of character and appearance with the English Doyles
mm,
and the unbroken use of the same crest and coat of arms. So here he is deliberately associating himself with a particular branch, but saying basically we are associated with them by virtue of the fact that we look a bit like them and we use the same coat of arms. But he did go on to use this the coat of arms, his coat of arms, which was the Doyle and Foley one, in the south-facing windows in Undershaw, the family home he built for his first wife, and they moved into in 1897. And sadly, I think that the windows haven't really survived. But there is actually a famous painting of Conan Doyle by Sidney Paget, which was painted around the same time, which has a coat of arms in the top right-hand corner, and it was reproduced in John Dixon Carr's biography of Conan Doyle in '49. But Nick Utekin and Catherine Cook have looked at that coat of arms and said, "Oh, it looks like it was painted
mm,
on separately at a later date." So there's a lot of sort of family myth making in this, and the most likely culprit for that airbrushing
mm.
was Adrian Conan Doyle. And so it's interesting in that context that Adrian set about creating his own Conan Doyle crest, and he was granted a coat of arms by the Chief Herald of Ireland on the 10th of December 1951, which is actually a quartering. It's not just of the
Mm,
Doyle and Foley; it's the Doyle, the Foley, the Pack, and the Percys.
mm,
So just as you say, it's quite a ridiculous
mm.
and very elaborate and very grand coat of arms. It's classically Adrian,
Mm.
um, and then that reappeared in other form as well.
Yes, and it's also worth noting at this point that there does exist a supposed Arthur Conan Doyle bookplate, which is a classic armorial bookplate,
Mm,
which can and has fooled people into
yeah.
thinking that this was actually Arthur's bookplate. It was actually perpetrated by Adrian again, and stuck in books which may well have belonged to his father, but his father certainly didn't design or approve the bookplate.
Mm, cheeky man.
Mm. I mean, there's a couple more interesting points come out of what you said there as well, Mark. In that you get Arthur Conan Doyle pointing towards the English Doyles, which is very interesting.
Isn't
Yeah,
it?
which it's fascinating given his background that he spent much of his life playing the Englishman,
Yeah.
given his Celtic mixed Scots-Irish background.
Yeah.
That he's pointing towards the English Doyles himself.
Yes. Yeah.
But then Adrian gets this permission from
From the
the Irish.
That's right. From the Chief Herald of
So
Ireland.
again, you've got this mix going on.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking as well in terms of Doyle's fiction, with the whole idea of family and branches, that this emerges in the Musgrave Ritual, where Reginald Musgrave is part of a cadet branch,
Yes.
a scion branch who broken away from the northern Musgraves.
Yeah.
So it does sneak into
It does.
unexpected places in Conan Doyle's fiction.
Yeah. There's another aspect I think that connects back to Conan Doyle's, I don't know, psychological makeup, I suppose you would call it, which is reflected in something Argentine D'Odd says, where he talks about how he could be a sort of present day crusader.
Hmm.
He says, some instinct tells me that the blood of a crusader runs in my veins. Even now, after the lapse of so many years, such exclamations as "By Our Lady" rise naturally to my lips, and I feel that, should circumstances require it, I am capable of rising in my stirrups and dealing an infidel a blow, say with a mace, which would considerably astonish him. And so now that he's got chivalric blood in his veins, and he's got his resurrected coat of arms, the only thing he needs to do to finish, to complete the picture, is Goresthorpe Grange. And to all intents and purposes, this seems like it's quite a good manor house for him.
Yes, he says himself, "It is soothing to me to know that I have slits in my staircase through which I can discharge arrows, and there is a sense of power in the fact of possessing a complicated apparatus, by means of which I am enabled to pour molten lead upon the head of the casual visitor. I am proud of my battlements, and of my circular uncovered sewer, which girds me round."
It's wonderful, isn't it?
Mm,
It's wonderful. But the problem with Goresthorpe Grange, of course, is that it lacks a ghost.
mm.
And anything that any self-respecting landed family needs is a ghost to occupy their property. He's particularly annoyed by the fact that his neighbour, who is a farmer with the wonderfully Dickensian name Jorrocks, has got a ghost and he hasn't. And he says, Jorrocks is densely unconscious of his good fortune, and his language when he refers to the apparition is painful to listen to. He little dreams how I covet every one of those moans and nocturnal wails which he describes with unnecessary objurgation. Things are indeed coming to a pretty pass when democratic spectres are allowed to desert the landed proprietors and annul every social distinction by taking refuge in the houses of the great unrecognised.
Yes, but then there comes the problem of how do you actually find a
Yes.
ghost if your house doesn't have one to begin with. But fortunately, Argentine D'Odd's wife has a very resourceful cousin called Jack Brocket, who he is described as one of those who lives by his wits. Um,
Yes.
and so Argentine goes to see him, and Jack and he, over many glasses of a different sort of spirit, have a discussion about this, and Jack says, "Leave it to me, I'll find out."
Yes.
And he goes off to London, and in a pub, the Lame Dog,
Yes.
he finds the perfect man, Mr. Abrahams, who promises that he can find Goresthorpe Grange a ghost.
Yes. I mean, this is. I do like that sequence in that it is
Mm,
casually mentioned that Brocket and Argentine Dodds are just progressively getting more and more drunk
mm.
as the evening is going on, and Brocket has a wonderful index, doesn't he, of all the different
Oh
people that
yeah,
he can go to.
yeah, and as you read about his reference works, you're very much reminded of the good old index.
Yes, it is. That's right. That's right. I mean, had he not got Jack Brocket to rely on, and had he been in the 1970s, he might have been able to go to Rent-A-Ghost, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
If your mansion house needs haunting, just call Rent-A-Ghost. But Abrams himself is quite a fun character as well. Yeah, he's a Cockney tradesman, and even though Argentine D'Odd has a particular image in his head, it turns out that Mr. Abrams doesn't really fulfill this image. He says, instead, however, of being the sallow-faced, melancholy-eyed man that I had pictured to myself, the ghost dealer was a sturdy little podgy fellow with a pair of wonderfully keen, sparkling eyes and a mouth which was constantly stretched in a good-humoured, if somewhat artificial grin. When he introduces himself, "I understand," he remarked, puffing at a trichinopoly, "that you want my help in fitting up this here house with a apparition." I think it's wonderful. But then you're going to get into this sort of his promise of what he can do in procuring this ghost. And at this point, there's maybe a hint as to why Conan Doyle didn't collect this in later years, because this is where he starts to make fun of spiritualism. And in particular, he sort of talks about, first of all, spiritualists who couldn't procure him a ghost to order, but also there's a little bit of mockery of the kind of artificial rules that surround channeling of ghosts. So at one point, Abram says that you have to convene at 10 to 1 in the morning. That's the best time. He says, some says midnight, but I says 10 to 1 when there ain't such a crowd and you can pick your own ghost. But also all this sort of strange private knowledge that these people seem to have. I'll sit here by the fire and do the preliminaries, which is more trouble than you'd think. He's just making fun here of spiritualist practices, and then you get into Abrams actually getting out some chalk and drawing a chalk circle and putting hieroglyphs on the ground and things to be able to raise the spirits, so that Argentine D'Odd can pick his choice from those that will materialize that evening. But this is a very strange picture of spiritualism, isn't it? Really, it's not really spiritualism as such. It's much more kind of occult.
Yeah, you got an odd mix going on, definitely. I mean, both what you could term the spiritualists and the occultists have their own different forms of ritual.
Yeah.
And ritual is all important, just as it is in organized religion. It's a very much a part of the procedure. There's a measure of poking fun at mediums, but there is also a stronger measure, really, in this of poking fun at the ritual occultists.
Yeah.
And their love of obscurantism and obfuscation and hidden and secret knowledge.
Yes.
Because Argentine D'Odd himself boasts that he has read so much ghost literature and is suffused with this and really knows his stuff. But then Abrams comes in, is able to easily bamboozle him.
Indeed.
And it is this whole idea of occultism and fraud and so being very, very close to one another.
Yeah.
And you get this very, very strongly in this character. And also with all the fussing about with the chalk circle and we must stay inside this for safety and so on. This is also pointing at an old friend of the podcast, Bulwer Lytton.
Yeah.
Yes. In particular, and his sort of the occult literature, which was very, very much full of this sort of ritual going on, and this is the only way that you will conjure up the ghost, or you conjure up a demon, and so it's all that is going on, and Doyle is very cleverly observing and mocking this, but gently.
Yes, he is. And I particularly like the line after he's done the chalk circle and he's drawn several hieroglyphs. He says that, not unlike the signs of the zodiac, Abrams then stood up and uttered a long invocation delivered so rapidly that it sounded like a single gigantic word in some uncouth guttural language. You can imagine. You can imagine this scene. It's very good. But I mean, it's worth saying that this is at a point when Conan Doyle was not steeped in spiritualism. He didn't really have a great deal of sort of structured knowledge and understanding. In fact, he if this was written, as we think, in summer 1883, it was before he joined the Portsmouth Literary and Scientific Society, which was in November 1883, and it's there that he met Major Drayson. And from Major Drayson, he gets more of a kind of structured schooling in theosophy and spiritualism and different aspects of supernatural study as well. It's also before the time that he met Henry Ball, an architect in Southsea, who also shared Conan Doyle's fascination for the paranormal. So this really does feel like this is, Conan Doyle in his later years, if he was to pick up this story and look back at it, you can imagine he would be deeply embarrassed by the contents, even though it's done good-humoured jesting. It's still embarrassing for the sort of spiritualist prophet he would become.
Oh, quite definitely. And I mean, as you say, with the dating, we were even 10 years before he joins the Society for Psychical Research. So all the what's actually going on here is he's very much like Dodd.
Yes, exactly.
He's got his knowledge from he's well steeped up in the fiction and the literature. I mean, he's grown up reading Blackwood's.
Yeah, That's right.
So, he really knows his stuff in terms of supernatural and weird fiction. And that's where most of this is coming from.
Yeah, that's it.
Hmm. But the most important part of the ritual is the taking of a certain essence of Leucoptolicus, which is Mr. Abraham's secret ingredient to successful raising of ghosts. And it seems to work.
Yes, it does. Now you have Argentine D'Odd experiencing a parade of ghosts
Mm.
that essentially audition for him one at a
Yes.
time. The first of which appears with these wonderful words: "I am the invisible nonentity. I have affinities and am subtle. I am electric, magnetic, and spiritualistic. I am the great ethereal sigh heaver. I kill dogs. Mortal, wilt thou choose me?" And if you haven't already got it from "I am electric, magnetic, and spiritualistic," the kill dogs bit will give it away, in that this is another reference to that story that we covered in the last episode, Bulwer Lytton's The Haunted and the Haunters.
Yeah, so we've got clear references here to Bulwer Lytton in terms of the magical ritual
Mm-hmm.
before the ghost appears, and then the first ghost to appear is quite definitely a clear reference to Bulwer Lytton. The I kill dogs
Yes.
really makes it clear, because one of the central happenings in The Haunted and the Haunters is the ghost's killing of the dog that the ghost hunters take with them.
Mm.
And it's just a rather, a piece of black humour
Yes.
on Doyle's part to throw that line in here.
Yeah. And then the next one that appears is a fiendish old woman who wears snuff-coloured silks and curses people. And she says, "Sir Walter was partial to me," which gives away this particular source.
Yeah, that's a clear reference to Sir Walter Scott, of course. And the story that's being referenced here is his celebrated ghost story, The Tapestried Chamber,
Mm.
which first appeared in 1829, which is a wonderful story about a general, a British general who's returned from the American War of Independence. He's a real tough nut,
Mm.
and is given a haunted room for the night in a friend's mansion house. And an old woman appears before him, and scares him out of his wits. And
That's a terrifying.
yeah, it's he refuses to spend another night under that roof. It's a really it's a brilliant story, and another very clever one.
Yeah.
And the trope also appears in Sheridan Le Fanu's story, Madame Crowell's Ghost.
Yes.
Where you've got a murderous old crone in that too. And that appeared in All the Year Round in 1870.
Mm.
So again, young Doyle might have been familiar with that story, and
Yes.
this trope has gone into his kind of cabinet of characters.
Yes, yes, it's
Mm,
one of his repertoire.
mm.
The next one is much more generic, isn't he? Is this
Oh yes, yeah.
a cavalier appears?
Mm.
Although I do like the line that, "I can emit hollow groans.
Mm.
I am patronized by many old conservative families. I am the original Manor House apparition. I work alone or in company with shrieking damsels." But
And
yeah,
so the other wonderful idea. I pierce and am pierced.
yes, that's right. Yeah, it's very good.
Mm.
Yeah, and this is just a typical ghost story that you might get anywhere. In fact, I was looking at there was one of the journals of the Society of Psychical Research a year later has an article about just such a ghost, a cavalier who they describe as a road ghost, somebody who appears essentially on the road between Richmond and Twickenham, outside of an old house, and has been cited several times. But the next one is very explicitly a Dickens reference, isn't it? This one, although when I caught it, I wasn't quite sure on what the influences were. The Dickens ghost says, "I am the lever of footsteps and the spiller of gouts of blood. I tramp upon corridors. Charles Dickens has alluded to me. I make strange and disagreeable noises. I snatch letters and place invisible hands on people's wrists. I am cheerful. I burst into peals of hideous laughter. Shall I do one now?"
Yeah, it's quite a confusing one, this, with the
Hmm.
Dickens reference there. Um, it's actually before you get the spirit speaking, you have this description. A feeling of intense horror stole over me, and I was aware of the presence of a ghastly creature in the room, of dim outlines and uncertain proportions. One moment it seemed to pervade the entire apartment, while at another it would become invisible, but
Mm.
always leaving behind it a distinctive consciousness of its presence. Now, it's rather more subtle
It
than
is,
what it
isn't it?
suddenly turns into.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And this uh, could possibly be a reference to Dickens' 1865 story, To Be Taken with a Grain of Salt, in which the member of a jury on a murder trial
Hmm.
is visited by the ghost of the murdered man.
Hmm.
But only this juror can see the ghost. But the ghost is wandering around the courtroom and affects other people, but
Oh.
is invisible. And the murderer himself sees the stamp of the ghost on the face of the juror and says, "Not him. I don't want him on the jury." So it's all quite, there's a lot of rather good subtle stuff going on. So I wonder if that's the reference there.
Mm. Yeah, I don't know
And
that one.
again, the peals of the peals of laughter
Yeah.
might come from the 1836 story, a Madman's Manuscript, um, in which you get the confession of a madman.
Mm.
He can't resist laughing all the time. And
That's
he
right.
goes off on his own. He has to laugh about the most awful things. And so I don't know whether it's kind of mixing all that together.
Yeah, yeah, the kind of spiller of gouts of blood was the one that sort of wrong-footed me on this one really, because
Mm, mm,
because it doesn't feel very Dickens that to me at all.
mm,
But yeah, that's an interesting one. And then you get into something which is much more, I would have associated with spiller of gouts of blood. Another archetype, a bit like the cavalier this time,
mm.
is the pirate captain
Yes.
who appears, which is Conan Doyle channeling all of his interest in the likes of Captain Kidd and Edward Teach Blackbeard,
Mm.
all the stuff that influences his Captain Sharky tales
Yeah.
as well.
Together with kind of road bandits and all of that kind of. He's a real kind of amalgamation of
Yes.
all these sort of ruffians. And you have, I am a murderer. I am a ruffian. I crouch when I walk. I step noiselessly. I know something of the Spanish Main. I can do the lost treasure business. I have charts.
I have charts.
It's or rather, and again, that's kind of the I have charts alluding to the kind of the hidden treasure
Yes.
archetype,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
ghosts often they're pointing to hidden treasure, and yeah, by this point in the parade, you can see that Doyle is doing this clear mix of fictional influences and folkloric influences, and just throwing them all together.
Yeah, he is. And
Mm.
then his next one is a particularly terrifying one, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's the Edgar Allan Poe one, which he
Yes.
describes as the American blood curdler.
Mm. It's good. We have the descriptions here are fantastic. It was a very tall man. The gaunt bones were protruding through the corroding flesh, and the features were of a leaden hue. A winding sheet was wrapped around the figure, and formed a hood over the head, from under the shadow of which two fiendish eyes, deep set in their grisly sockets, blazed and sparkled like red-hot coals. The lower jaw had fallen upon the breast, disclosing a withered, shriveled tongue and two lines of black and jagged fangs. He's letting himself go, and then when it speaks, I am the American blood curdler. I am the embodiment of Edgar Allan Poe. I am circumstantial and horrible. I am a low-caste spirit-subduing spectre. I am grisly and nauseous. No depending on artificial aid. Work with grave clothes, a coffin lid, and a galvanic battery.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Obviously, this is bringing out Doyle's absolute love of Poe.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is Poe didn't write ghost stories.
No. No.
He did, he just he didn't do that. But they are horror stories,
Mm.
if you want to just generalize. And this spirit is a supposed spirit of Poe's stories, and Doyle knew better,
Yes.
but already Poe's stories are being reduced to a set of gruesome stage effects, which is what
Yes.
has happened in the 20th century in a big way. And you think of the Roger Corman movies;
Yeah,
it's
of
all
course.
this setup of effects, and this is what you're getting here.
Mm.
And I find it fascinating as well at this stage, 1883. Already, Doyle is
Early.
picking up on the idea of the American blood curdler.
Yeah.
The fact that American fiction of this kind is often reliant upon gore and effect.
And shock, yes.
And this would definitely go on into the 20th century, where
Yeah.
the American school would take over and dominate. And
Yes.
it's interesting, with that kind of the gore, the shock effect, the shock and gore, yes, would be what would come in over some of the more subtle
Yes.
English ghost stories. The sort of stories where sometimes you don't even know what's happening.
Yeah.
Everything is more subtle, whereas this is seen as Poe changing the game.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, all of these ghosts that he's doing are really pointing to an earlier time, aren't they? They're
Mm,
all
mm,
much earlier kind of depictions of ghosts. And as we talked
mm,
about in the last episode, this is the 1880s is a point of transition in ghost stories, isn't it? The 1880s,
mm.
1890s, as it moves into maybe more psychological
Mm.
as well. But this is him really reveling in all the horrors.
That side of it was, again, as you say, this is a period of transition and change, and you've got, again, Dickens
Yes.
is doing a lot of this change, where he's taking, the classic trope. You can think of the chain clanking ghost. And Jacob Marley, he
Mm,
turns this on its head, and Marley is imprisoned with his own, cash boxes and keys and so on, and it's using that for a purpose. and
mm,
and and later on in, um, Ebar James would refashion the sheeted ghost, in "O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad,"
mm.
where what had become rather a standard jokey ghost, James refashions into a creature of real horror. So
Absolutely.
we've got all of this is going on, and Doyle's picking up on this, and he's playing a part in it himself.
Yeah, he is absolutely.
Mm.
And his final ghost is the one that Argentine D'Odd actually settles on, who is in the end this young girl who is plaintive and sentimental, beautiful and ill-used. I have been forsaken and betrayed. I shriek in the night time and glide down passages. My antecedents are highly respectable and generally aristocratic, which is almost certainly why he goes for them. And of course, at this point, we get the punchline as he's sort of saying, "Yes, I'll have her, I'll have her." At which point, his wife shakes him up and says, "We've been robbed." But just thinking about this whole section of the ghosts, I mean, reading it again, what struck me was that we already know Argentine Dodd has a great knowledge of supernatural fiction. He's got a real interest in it as well. And what you're getting in this section is a kind of classification of different ghosts.
Mm,
You're getting, which really speaks to the kind of the scientific mentality of the 1880s, where there
mm,
was an awful lot of classification of phenomena, and it's fascinating to see it reflected here because, of course, this is what would the SPR would go on to do.
mm,
This is
mm,
what Conan Doyle would be engaging with in later life as well. This kind of um, quasi-scientific, pseudo-scientific rationalization of different paranormal phenomena into different kind of categories and boxes. But you get it here in a very jokey form
mm.
in the form of selecting a ghost.
And it's tying into this growth as well at this time of consumer culture.
Yes,
You can buy a
you can
ghost.
buy anything.
Here's a conveyor belt of ghosts.
Yeah.
You've got that, and you've also got, tying in there, an idea of the labour market, of
Yes.
of people being interviewed for a job almost. I mean, I was reminded at the end when Argentine Dodd picks the plaintive young lady ghost at
Mm.
the end. Oh, that will do. And I was very much reminded of Geoffrey Rucastle in the
Yes.
speeches at the governess's agency. Capital, capital, capital. That will
That's
do.
right.
It's very much the same sort of setup.
It is, isn't it? It
Mm.
is. Yeah.
Yes, after Mrs. Dodd has woken up Argentine and said, "We've been robbed." We get to work out that the heart of the problem has been the leucoptolicus,
Yes.
which is later analysed by a doctor, who This is one of the heavier-handed comedy moments, isn't it? Dr. T.E. Stube.
Yes.
Yes, work that one out. But he analysed it as chloral.
Yes.
And we find out that Mr. Abrahams is actually the Nottingham cracksman, Jemmy Wilson,
Yes.
who has taken a liking to Argentine D'Odd's silver plate with his coat of arms stamped on it,
Yes.
which have now disappeared. So yeah, we have this as the big reveal at the end, and it does work very well. It's cliched, but works really well. And you also look back. This is again Doyle picking up on previous use of this kind of thing, and I'm thinking particularly the influence of Dickens
Mm.
coming in strongly here. We've got this in the Pickwick Papers, which Doyle had certainly read.
Mm.
There's two of the stories in particularly. The story of the bagman,
Yes.
in which a traveller sleeps in an inn, and an old chair in his room turns into an old man, and gives him some story about the inn.
Mm.
And this actually is seen after, I think it's 7 glasses of punch.
Yes.
And then a later story, the story of the bagman's uncle, in which after a wild drinks party in Edinburgh, the uncle falls asleep in an old kind of graveyard of mail coaches. And he wakes up to find himself in a ghostly mail coach and has various adventures. So it is this kind of, did they see ghosts, or was it all the drink or
Yes.
the drugs? And perhaps in Dickens, the most famous example occurs in The Christmas Carol, when Scrooge first meets Jacob Marley, and he says, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." So again, it's that whole tradition that
Yes.
Doyle's tapping into, and making a very successful job of.
Yeah, it does remind me a bit. In fact, this whole story sort of slightly remind me a bit of a literary mosaic, which we covered
Yes,
previously.
yeah, yeah.
In that, again, this is Conan Doyle bringing out um, a cast of literary, in that case, um, uh, you know, past writers, but
Mm,
essentially it's on the same, riffing on the same idea,
mm,
and
mm,
also literary mosaic starts in that case with this. I think the gentleman has had a pint of beer and a
mm,
Welsh rarebit
mm,
supper, and that's what has induced
mm.
his dreamlike state.
It's a kind of showing off as well.
Yeah, it is
With both of them, of look what I've read, and if you're as
definitely.
well read as me, you'll spot the references, dear reader.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm,
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the story as well is interesting as a comic ghost story, because I mean now
mm,
we're at the end of the story. We know that it isn't really a ghost story as such,
mm,
um, you know. But there are. This is a period of time where people are starting to play with the conventions because
mm,
they're so well established, aren't they? And yes, you've got people like Mark Twain writing in 1875. He has a ghost story, which is a funny little piece about the Cardiff giant who is haunting a museum that has his body in, only to discover that it's a plaster cast of his body and he's been haunting the wrong museum. But this whole story reminded me a bit as well about Oscar Wilde's The Canterville Ghost,
Oh yeah, yeah.
which is going to be 4 years after this,
Mm,
1887, and you just mentioned before there, Paul, about consumerism. I mean,
mm,
that's a big attack on consumerism
mm,
in the Canterville Ghost, and that too has references to the Society of Psychical Research,
mm,
Myers, Podmore,
mm,
and the likes as well.
mm,
And then there are other writers, maybe a little bit later. There's Kendrick Bangs, writes a very funny story, "The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall," 1894, which is about a water spirit who is finally defeated when they're tricked to turn into ice
mm.
on a particularly cold day. But it has some particularly wonderful overblown dialogue like, "Congeal, madam, congeal. You have drenched me and mine for 203 years, madam. Tonight you have had your last drench."
Well, Bangs is particularly interesting. I mean, he specialised in
Yeah.
the kind of the comedy supernatural story. His most famous novel is A Houseboat on the Styx, published in
Mm.
1896, in which the shades of various people like Napoleon and
Mm.
Julius Caesar convene on the other side. And then he wrote a sequel, The Pursuit of the Houseboat, in 1897, which features the shade of Sherlock Holmes, no less,
Yeah.
and the book is dedicated to Conan Doyle. So again, he's part of that circle. This is all tapping in, but of course Doyle was writing his comedy ghost stuff in the previous decade.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that whole thing about the telling of stories as well. That's something
Mm,
that's picked up by other writers. I mean, Jerome K. Jerome wrote a very nice short book called Told After Supper,
mm,
1891, a collection which is really pastiching, not so much ghost stories as the poor telling of ghost
mm,
stories that happen
mm,
with families around the fire who are
mm.
slowly getting more and more sozzled of an evening. And there's an excellent story in there about the ghost of the Blue Chamber who had killed a Christmas wait with a lump of coal. And the uncle is telling the story. There's a very good bit where he says, "So how did he do it?" asked Mr. Combs with eager anxiousness. "Was it difficult?" "I do not know how he did it," replied my uncle. "He did not explain the process. The wait had taken up a position just inside the front gate and was singing a ballad. It is presumed that, when he opened his mouth for B flat, the lump of coal was thrown by the sinful man from one of the windows, and that it went down the wait's throat and choked him." "Oh, you want to be a good shot, but it's certainly worth trying," murmured Mr. Combs thoughtfully.
And this whole tradition. I mean, it's as with horror, so with ghost stories, the line between the really serious stuff and the comedy is very, very fine,
Yeah.
and you've got to know how to tread it in both cases.
Mm.
But it's the ghost as figure of fun is a very powerful, again, trope within society, and it's still hugely popular.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned earlier, you made a reference to the 1970s kids series Rent-A-Ghost, which spoofed the whole thing brilliantly. But another 1970s series, again for kids, was The Ghosts of Motley Hall
Oh,
by Richard
yes.
Carpenter, which had a series of ghosts in an old mansion and their interactions with the house agent and various adventures going on there. And it's been brought up to date.
Mm.
The BBC has a hit on their hands at the moment called Ghosts, which is
Yes,
the
of
same
course.
the same premise essentially. Ghosts from different eras, all inhabiting the same
Yeah.
house
Yeah, very
for
funny.
comic effect.
Yes, that BBC series is a is a very entertaining one. So, yes, so that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you very much for listening. If you are interested in reading the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com, and the website will also tell you how you can become a sponsor on PayPal or Patreon. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
Next time we'll be taking a slightly different format. 2023 has been a pretty important year for Conan Doyle scholarship and attention.
Mm,
There have been numerous books, a significant television series. So we'll do a Doings of Doyle review of the year.
that will be great. We'll really look forward to that. So, until next time, this being our Christmas show, we'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
If your mansion house needs haunting, just call Rent-A-Ghost. We've got spooks and ghouls and freaks and fools at Rent-A-Ghost. Hear the Phantom of the Opera sing a haunting melody. Remember, what you see is not a mystery, but Rent-A-Ghost.